Yes, and I appreciate you asking it that way, because the question is whether or not this federal law gives any president the power to federalize the National Guard. And the answer is, in my view, that this federal law is a broad grant of authority to a president, and that there's language that says a rebellion, or dangers of a rebellion, but it's not clearly defined. And essentially, the statute says when the normal channels don't work, when the normal law enforcement mechanisms don't work, then the president has the power to federalize the National Guard. We should be clear about what this does and doesn't mean. It does not mean that we are suspending something called posse comitatus, which means that the military it cannot act as a domestic law enforcement agency. That is still in effect. Right now, the National Guard can just act in a supporting role, can help to protect federal agents, can help to protect federal property. So I think at this point, the president is, regardless of your policy views, on pretty firm ground. The next question, whether or not, if there's an escalation, the president has the power to kind of pull the cord and say, now I want to invoke the Insurrection Act, that is legally a harder challenge, a higher threshold for the president. And then I think there would be more vigorous challenges to the president's authority.
Professor Levinson, in your view, what was the moment that it became clear that local law enforcement could not handle the situation? And indeed, the switch was flipped, that this would be a case, in your view, that would actually allow the National Guard to be deployed. What was it that you saw that happened?
Well, I want to be clear that I think there are plenty of people who disagree that that moment occurred. And I think there are critics of the president who say that moment didn't occur, that LAPD was getting things under control, and that we weren't in a situation that would give rise to the president having this power under this federal law, again, Title 10. And so I don't want to offer my particular perspective on whether or not we hit that moment as somebody who analyzes the law. What I'll say is we have a very big gulf of opinion. We have the governor and the mayor saying we were fine, we didn't need help. And then we have the president of the United States saying, yes, you did. And this is a situation that's rare because, typically speaking, if the president does federalize the National Guard, it's because a governor and or local leaders have asked him to do so.
All right. So then we have on the flip side, again, like I kind of kicked this off, Professor Levinson, on this idea between federal powers and state powers, right? I feel like it's, in our fabric as a U.S., as our nation, right? Like there's always kind of, on some level, a little bit of battle between these two sides. California is suing the Trump administration over what has happened. We have seen the California Governor Gavin Newsom come out on a post on X. So do they have any legal position or power? In our last hour, balance of power, I heard one lawyer saying, I'd love to take his case. I think it's a strong case. What do you think?
So what I think here is that Governor Newsom is going to argue that the president is infringing on state sovereignty, and that under the 10th Amendment, which we all know from high school civics, reserves powers that are not given to the federal government, to the states and to the people. And I think that Governor Newsom is going to argue, first and foremost, you're infringing on state authority. Second, I think that he'll make the argument that the predicate facts, the prerequisites before you can federalize the National Guard under Title 10, that they're simply not there, that this isn't a rebellion. We're not seeing the danger of a rebellion. In my perspective, the federal law that the president is operating under is a very broad grant of authority to him. I know I said that before. I'm emphasizing that here. And so I do think that a challenge to his authority does face an uphill battle. I'm not putting my thumb on the scale of what I think is happening on the ground so much as what I think the language of the statute provides.
So I guess my question is about if this escalates, and I think that's a concern for a lot of people, Professor. You mentioned the idea of an insurrection and what that actually would look like, and then the Trump administration would have to face another question about the deployment. And I'm curious, what would, in your view, characterize an insurrection?
It's a really important question. And if you look at the Insurrection Act, this old act from the 1800s, it doesn't have bright line definitions. And that's fairly typical What we're looking at in order to see if the president has the power to invoke the Insurrection Act is whether or not there is some sort of violent or unlawful upheaval, whether or not people have essentially taken to the streets. We're looking to similar questions that we are currently under Title X, but we're looking to see if things are, for lack of a better way of describing it, appreciably worse. And again, we're looking for a situation where I think the assumption behind the statute is that the normal channels aren't panning out. So if the president does decide to use the Insurrection Act, that would be a significant escalation. It would, again, suspend posse comitatus, which we talked about briefly before, and it would allow, what does that mean? It would allow the National Guard to act as domestic law enforcement. It would allow the National Guard to do much more. They could, instead of acting as supporting cast members, essentially, they could instead help arrest, implement searches, seizures, et cetera. And that would be very different from what we're used to.
Hey, one last question very quickly, 30 seconds, if I may. What's the difference? How do you know the difference between protest, which again is so much a part of what we do in the United States, versus insurrection? Is it very clear? Just quickly.
I think it's not clear. It's clear on the sides, right? So, and what we're seeing right now is a debate among our elected officials as to whether or not we're there yet.